Hey guys, I am back to do one of my more intermittent series, but you guys seem to really enjoy them, and I enjoy making them. So I am here to do another books to documentaries episode, and I will be doing that on some media related to the Theranos scandal. And that's really been in the media lately because Hulu did a mini series called The Dropout that starred Amanda Seyfried that fictionalized this story. I watched the first episode and then decided that I would not watch any more of it after doing the documentary and the book and several internet features, and I got really obsessed with this, okay? I decided not to watch the Hulu series after the first episode for reasons that I will explain. So we will just be focusing in this video on the John Carreyrou book and the Alex Gibney HBO documentary. Now, sometimes when I do this series, the book and the documentary are directly related, meaning that someone made the documentary based on the book. That is not the case here. These were independent projects, but I think that they are in a really interesting conversation with each other, and we're gonna talk about it. So the documentary came out in 2019 and it was called The Inventor: Out for Blood in Silicon Valley. Again, I watched this on HBO. You may be able to find it other places. It's just about 2 hours long. The book, which first was published in 2018, is called Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou. So I read those in kind of backwards time order for a reason, which is that I watched the documentary before I read the book, which is not something I usually do. But again, I think is what puts these two things into interesting conversation. And also the HBO documentary is the reason I knew John Carreyrou wrote a book. So chicken or the egg situation here. So the Inventor documentary was directed by Alex Gibney, and if you don't know who he is but you love documentaries, you should. Alex Gibney has put together some incredible documentaries. A lot of them are on HBO, and I basically found The Inventor because I was typing his name into the HBO search engine to see if there were other documentaries of his that I hadn't watched, because I'd watched some other ones. And this one came up, and I had been seeing the story kind of in the news because of the Hulu miniseries. And I thought, well, it's under 2 hours, it's like an hour 59. And so I was like, well, this could be interesting. It's really out of my normal zone, like business, medical industry, like startup, Silicon Valley, that's not my thing. So I thought, oh, maybe it'll be interesting, to take a break from this really hard and heavy history or politics stuff that I normally do. So before I really talk about the documentary, let's talk about what this is if you're not familiar. So Theranos was a medical testing company founded by Elizabeth Holmes. And she dropped out of Stanford in her freshman year to start a company where her idea was to have home testing kits for your blood. So as you may know, right now, in order to get your blood tested for any number of diseases or problems, you have to go to a doctor, have blood drawn from giant needles sometimes, and send that off to a lab, get that tested. But of course, that can also be prohibitive to people who don't have a doctor, don't have insurance, all that kind of stuff. So the idea behind Theranos was to have a mini lab that you could have on a shelf in your home that you could buy, and rather than taking a giant needle of blood, it would just take a prick from a finger, and you would be able to test yourself at home for disease. Now this sounds like a lovely idea. Somehow at 19, Elizabeth Holmes convinced a number of very powerful investors to go in on her idea with her. It did change some over the years, but in the end, when Theranos was valued at billions of dollars, she had people like Henry Kissinger and army generals on her board of directors, and she met with then Vice President Biden. She was on the cover of major magazines like Forbes. She was considered the next Steve Jobs. But what we found out since then is that it was all a lie. She was having investors give her money and having partnerships with people like Walgreens to use machines that didn't work and endangered the lives and the health of the people that she was using those machines on and defrauding investors. She was recently sentenced to a number of years in prison for fraud. So I had no idea of the scope of this when I started the Gibney documentary. And as his work always is, it was just very well produced, a very clear story. And because he has, I'm sure, the financial backing and the name, he can often get very high level people in these stories to talk to him. So insiders from Theranos, people from Stanford. He really got most of the major players in this story to talk to him in his documentary, including the young people who were the some of the major whistleblowers that eventually uncovered the whole thing investigations. I think the major thread from the entire documentary, and something that I don't think is ever really well explained, is how Elizabeth managed to fool so many people. Because the idea that you would just give someone millions of dollars at the age of 19 when they haven't finished a degree and they have this idea was really confusing to me. And like, what was it about her that made so many people believe in her for so long? And unfortunately for the documentary, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the book, it was just kind of like people just kind of talked about how she was just really able to put particularly men under her spell. But everybody is just like, how? We don't know. Because she just had this kind of magnetism that made people believe her. I watch her in the videos now being like, well, I don't get it, but I also know that she's a fraud. So the documentary is based on like kind of this understanding that she was able to fool so many people, and so many people just believed in her. And even when they maybe had evidence to the contrary, they kept following her. And you just kind of have to believe that. Again, the strongest part of the documentary is hearing from the people who worked at Theranos, and including the two younger whistleblowers. I think they were both like in their like early 20s, who were basically went to Theranos to do good work. They really thought that they were going to change the world with this device, and realized that they were potentially really harming people. And their story really of how they came to the company with such high expectations and then slowly became disillusioned, and their wild stories of the different corners that were being cut in the lab, and how they eventually decided to become whistleblowers, and then how they were targeted afterward. So even though this is a documentary on Elizabeth Holmes, I think the human story that really comes through this is theirs, and their belief in standing up for what was right, even in the face of this very well-funded corporate opposition from Theranos. And I think part of the reason you connect with them so much, and it's easy to make the documentary kind of about them, is because Elizabeth is still so kind of like, what? Obviously she's not in this documentary. She did not agree to be interviewed, so it's all everybody else. And you're just kind of left watching interview and video clips of her and just being like, wow. Like, how did this multi-billion-dollar fraud just get built? It just feels crazy. So one of the things that you can't do in a 2-hour documentary, right, is talk about all of the different nuances, the smaller things, and you can't really dig into the business nitty-gritty of really how this company worked and the fraud worked and all that kind of stuff. And so when John Carreyrou appears in the Alex Gibney documentary and they say he wrote a book, etc., I was like, oh, well, I have to read the book. And the book might be drier than this documentary because this documentary is a very human story, about particularly these two whistleblowers. But I just am struggling, even after watching all 2 hours, of really understanding how a fraud on this scale happened. I want more detail. I need more information. And so I went and I read Bad Blood. So I ended up rating Bad Blood 5 stars, and I have just such amazing things to say about this book. So if you are interested in this at all, read the book. One of the things, like I said, I was worried about the book being a little bit drier because it would have to explain, I think in more detail, medical and business concepts that I do not understand. And one amazing part that you have to say about the book up front is that Carrie Rue explains these business and medical situations that are going on, some of the science, both in business and in the medical field, in really understandable ways. And I am not a science person. I am not a science nerd. I know nothing about how blood, is tested and, disease and all. I know nothing about it. But I never once had a problem with this book where he was explaining something I then didn't understand. I might not fully grasp it, but he writes about it in a very, very clear way where you understand the basics, and more importantly, you understand the implications. So I have to say right off the bat, I was a little bit afraid of that, and it was amazing. Second of all, this is just such a well-written book, just in general. As a story of, business scandal and medical fraud and all that kind of stuff, Carrie Rue has a way of carrying this story in such a readable and interesting fashion that even though it was something I didn't know much about, it was topics that I had to learn a lot of the details of, I just never wanted to put it down. I was just listening to it and I was like, whoa, don't stop. I want to know. And I've watched the documentary already, right? That's why that's important to say. There are things where it wasn't like I didn't know what was going to happen necessarily. I watched the documentary and I knew. And I'm still sitting there like, whoa. And what you learned from the book that's not in the documentary, and I don't know if it's because the people in the documentary couldn't get certain people to interview and therefore tell their own story, but in the book, you realize that instead of how the documentary kind of shows it, which is that there is a company, Theranos, and these 2 young people come and they work for this company and they realize something is wrong and they become whistleblowers and then it's all uncovered. There's a whole middle step in the middle involving someone from Elizabeth's past and his relationship with her parents, who decides that he really royally wants to screw her, and a whole thing involving patent law, which again I know nothing about, that directly, it's like a missing domino from the documentary that makes some of the questions I had about how the whistleblowers were able to accomplish some stuff make more sense, because there's this whole thing going on in the middle that was already in the legal system, already kind of tipping some people off, that makes the whole house of cards a little bit easier to collapse. And like I said, that's really not represented in the documentary, but is integral to the ins and outs of the full story. In the beginning of the book, it is more, I think, stereotypical, here's Elizabeth's early history, and here's some of the history of Silicon Valley, and maybe why in this boom of Silicon Valley and the young, entrepreneur thing, that people were willing to give money to Elizabeth. And I'll touch more on that in a minute, but, as the story moves forward, Carrie Rue makes himself a character. And he doesn't attempt to present this story with himself removed, which I think is really important because, again, once he begins to investigate Theranos, he gets a lot of the same corporate pushback and bullying that the whistleblowers eventually get. And he is integrally involved in getting the story of those 2 whistleblowers told. And so he forms relationships with them and, comes to understand the absolute terror they're being put through. And so you might potentially find the beginning a little bit staler and more like stereotypical business nonfiction, But again, as it moves into the investigation, it was cool because it's two parallel books. It's how John Carreyrou uncovered a bunch of this stuff, and also the story of what he was uncovering, which I just appreciated seeing like a journalist at work. But again, it is so hard for these people to capture how Elizabeth was able to pull this off. And I don't think that that's also something that Carreyrou is really able to portray very well. And he met her. He interviewed her with a bank of lawyers standing behind her, but he even met her. And, you know, I don't think Alex Gibney necessarily did, but he is still unable to say, like, here's why, like, here's the magnetic thing about her. Here's, you know, why so many people were willing to put their utter faith in her in the face of facts that contravened what they knew. And after watching the documentary and reading the book and watching some smaller features on it on like YouTube, I just kind of came to the realization that no one really knows. Like, there was just something about her that caught all of these people's imagination. And even if it was something like, there's one of her ex-professors at Stanford is like, she's really, really good at seducing older men. Not like sexually, but like making them like have a connection with her. And even if that was true, none of these people are obviously going to admit it. So it's easier and safer and maybe even true to say there was just something about her and it inspired people to follow her. The fact that they didn't have an answer in either the documentary or the book for that critical piece of the story was the reason that I watched the first episode of The Dropout. And what I saw there was a young, you know, Amanda Seyfried playing a young Elizabeth who at 19 basically gets funding from a professor there who eventually leaves his job to like work on her company with her. And even in the Hulu series, they kind of gloss over that and they're just like, yeah, he thought that she was smart, so he left his job to follow her. And I was like, okay. And it made me like really just sad that again, that one thing that I was looking for wasn't in it. And so I didn't continue the series. That doesn't mean that the series is bad. I just went looking for a specific type of information I didn't find. And then I was like, I'm grumpy about it, so I'm gonna go watch something else. If you know nothing about this scandal, welcome to the wild world that is the Theranos scandal. If you know about it from some of the news reports, because again, she was finally just sent to trial and sentenced, and there are still some ongoing trials around this whole thing, and you're like, I wonder what that's about. You can watch the Alex Gibney documentary. It's 2 hours. There is a feature that Yahoo Finance did that I found on YouTube that's 30 minutes. Again, length gives you exactly what you're going to get out of it. 30 minutes versus 2 hours. And if that's where you want to stop, then that's fine. But if, like me, you're really interested in this story, but are worried that the book might be too technical or too dry to be interesting, all I have to say is don't worry about that. Give the book a try because it is just spectacularly written. It's just so engaging. Again, despite being a topic I know nothing about and had to learn a lot about through the book, very, very accessible. And I gave it 5 stars. Highly recommend it. If you have watched the entire Hulu series and want to give me some of your thoughts and feelings, please do leave those down in the comments. If you know of some other media related to this that I could go watch or read, leave that down in the comments as well, because I have become like weirdly obsessed with this. It's just like fascinating to me. And I've just been consuming a lot of media about it. So if you have recommendations, if you have other thoughts that I didn't mention on the book or the documentary, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I'm gonna go obsess about this a little bit more. Thanks, guys. Bye.